1. Childhood's End. He had been human once. He had to remember that. But it was so hard. When the bloodlust came over him, he could almost taste the kill in his fangs, feel the small bodies crunching, become intoxicated by the fresh blood that would dribble down his throat. He tried to fight it again, as he tried to fight it each and every time. And, as always, he failed. Night had fallen, burying the humans who lived here in their small houses, huddled together for companionship and warmth. He had no one. There was nobody to keep him company, no companion to offer him warmth. His only warmth came from the thrill of the hunt, his only companionship from the prey he ran down and then devoured. He was alone, unique, the sole member of his kind. But he had been human once. Long, long ago. He could barely remember those days. In his new state, time had little meaning. His mind wasn't working as it had once. Days and weeks blurred together. The only times were night or day, feast or famine. By day he hid, knowing that if anyone saw him he'd be killed. Night he hunted. If it was a good night, he ate, crunching the fresh bones, draining the delectable marrow, chewing on the tough sinews. If it was a poor night, he fasted, waiting for the following day, his belly growling and complaining. That always made the bloodlust worse. Rabbits were good prey, but they were fast. He had to be faster to catch them. But with rabbits, one bite from his massive jaws was more than sufficient to kill. Foxes were good too, with their rich, predatory taste and hunter's blood. Foxes he admired. They were almost as good at killing as he was. But he could kill them, and they avoided him. The small ponies were a feast, but much harder to take down. They were wiry and tough, fighting with their hooves and teeth, kicking and snorting. And he couldn't kill them with a single bite, as he did with the rabbits and foxes. For the ponies, he'd developed a trick of biting their throats and then hanging on until they died choking in their own blood, or until one of his paws could break their necks. If he took a pony, then he could drag it to his lair and eat for a week without having to venture out to hunt and to risk being seen. Not many people came out onto the moors, and virtually no one was foolish enough to try the trip at night. But humans were tricky, and they were curious, and they were lethal. There was no animal that could hurt him out here. Even the ponies could only bruise him through his thick fur. Humans could do more with their guns. He'd been shot at once, and in the stormy weather he could still feel the ache from the shot. They wouldn't ever get another chance to shoot him. The clouds covered the crescent moon, and he was satisfied. Sniffing the air cautiously, he could tell that there were no humans around. They were not smart enough to be able to hide from his heightened senses. He could detect a faint trail of rabbits and the merest hint of a fox. The main scent this night was badger. Badgers had claws, and they fought hard and long, but his fur warded off their worst slashes, and they were good eating. He could almost taste the hot, delicious blood in his mouth, and the bloodlust came down over his senses like a curtain at the end of a play. He had been human once, but now he was only a killer beast. Howling his happiness, his anger, his hunger, his hatred for what he had become, he sprang out onto Dartmoor. With long, loping strides, he began to cover the distance to his prey. Tonight would be a good night. Tonight he would feast. Tonight something would die. Ben Tolliver loved the sea as he had never loved any human being. He'd been married twice and fathered 8 children, but he loved none of them as much as he adored his silvery mistress. He had loved these waters as long as he could remember, He'd been born beside them, and he knew he'd die beside them, or in them, as his father and grandfather had done, and as his brother and 2 sons had done. The sea was a fickle mistress, Tolliver knew. She could be sweet and serene, romantic and flirtatious. She could coyly beckon you down to her cold embraces, then turn violent and murderous in an instant. She was his only mistress, but he wasn't foolish enough to ever think of trusting her capricious moods. He was content simply to be with her, sharing the same night breezes that stirred the dark surface of the waters. He felt an empathy with the sea. When she was calm, he felt rested. When the waters raged, he felt helpless and imprisoned. He'd spent more than 60 years here, either floating in his small boat in these waters, or else in his small cabin where he could look down on the sea. It had been a rough life, and a poor one, no question at all about that. No Tolliver had ever grown wealthy from the sea. But he was content. Even with the loss of both wives and his sons, he wouldn't have wanted anything to have been different. Then he chuckled to himself. Well, maybe that saucy lass at the Dog and Pony. Now, if she had agreed to some of those romps he had often suggested... But aside from that, he was content. It had been a hard life, true, but a fair one. He'd been able to live as he'd wished. And here he was, as always, floating gently on the sea in his old boat. It was a lot like him, grizzled, getting no younger, and maybe a slight achy in places, but overall a good, stout craft that had many a year left to it. And like him, his boat was built for the sea and would be at home nowhere else. Tolliver sighed and straightened up from his nets. He had checked them thoroughly, as he always did. One small tear in the mesh could ruin a night's fishing. He'd seen plenty of foolish fisherfolk lose their entire catch like that, but it had never happened to him, nor would it. The day he lost a single fish was the day he'd retire from the sea, the day he'd lie down and die. The sea was his mistress, and he knew that if he treated her right, showed her the proper respect and care, why then she'd be flattered and give generously other bounty. He heaved the net into place, ready to cast it over the side and into the dark, nocturnal waters. Then he paused, astounded. There'd been talk in the taverns recently from some of the younger men about mermaids and fairy fires under the sea, but he'd always dismissed it as the foolishness of poor men in their cups. He had believed it was the beer talking, not the youngsters. Why, he had fished these waters 60 years and never seen any sights such as they had claimed. Until tonight. The moon had hidden itself behind the clouds, and the silvery reflections on the waves were gone. But the sea wasn't dark and impenetrable as it should have been. Far below the surface, Tolliver could see light. The fairy fires, then, were real. With the surface breaking and shivering as the waves lapped past his small craft, it was impossible to make out much. Just that there were lights down there, lots of them. Small pinprick lights shivering and shaking with the movement of the waters. But real. Moving to the bows, Tolliver discovered that he had a better view of them. As he stared downwards, a pattern started to become clear. It was as if the fires were on the spokes of some immense wheel, maybe 200 feet across. The pattern was quite regular, the lights all lined up neat as you please. The centre of the wheel lay about 1/4 of a mile to starboard of him. As he watched, utterly wrapped up in this beautiful mystery, Tolliver realised that the wheel analogy was very appropriate. The lights were moving, turning about their hub, just like some immense wheel in motion. The procession of lights was slow and ponderous, but it was nevertheless quite real. Tolliver was captivated. He had loved the sea in all her strange and often terrifying moods for 6 decades, but he had never been a witness to a sight like this. just like a woman to keep all her best secrets hidden till it was too late for you to take advantage of them. Tolliver couldn't tear his eyes from the sight. What could be causing this? He had no idea. He had heard enough foolish talk in his years as a fisherman to know plenty of legends of Davy Jones and his ilk. He knew for a fact, though, that such talk was utter nonsense. There was plenty of life in the sea, but it was all victim to line or net or harpoon. None of it was intelligent, none capable of building the sight he was seeing now. But neither could man. In this year of grace, 1880, there were many marvels about that Tolliver had never dreamed of seeing in his simple life, but there wasn't a man alive who could have built this wheel of light he was watching. That engineer, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, now there had been a genius, building ships the like of which this world had never seen before. Many folks had laughed at him. Brunel had been proven right time after time. A man with vision, Brunel had been. But even he could never have dreamed of constructing anything like this. Besides, he'd been dead for 20 years now, and there wasn't a man alive that could hold a match to his candle. Then what was he seeing? What could be the explanation for this strange wheel of lights, turning with grim relentlessness off his starboard bow? Tolliver had heard from some of his colleagues about fish that had their own light, a bit like those fireflies whose bums burned bright on nights they were looking for love. So Tolliver could believe those stories. Still, even granted that there were fish whose backsides were filled with fire, he couldn't imagine anything that would induce them to line themselves up as if they were ready for a dance, and then slowly turn around a common centre. It went against everything Tolliver knew. So then what? A shape flickered past barely under the surface of the water, blocking the lights for a second, and then it was gone. It must have been a fish. What else could it have been? It couldn't have been what he had thought. It couldn't have been. It rippled past the boat again, and Tolliver shivered in shock. Cartwheels of fire were bad enough. Maybe he was going senile, or maybe his old mistress was having fun with him. He had seen a human face, and then the flicker of a fish's tail. A mermaid? Tolliver wished he could laugh at this stupidity. Mermaids were seen more often in the bottom of a jar of ale than in the bottom of the sea. But he hadn't been drinking this night, and he had seen something that looked like a woman's face, a bit of a body, and then there had been the fish's tail, grey and smooth. Not at all like the legends suggested. No green scales or overripe breasts. Just a face, slim form, and tail. He had to have imagined that. There were no such things as merfolk who farmed the pastures of the sea. They were just legend and tall tales. On the other hand, if there were some kind of folk who were, God alone knew how, able to live under the sea, then perhaps they had made that monster wheel below him. It went against his experiences and all he knew about the world, but it did make a sort of off-kilter sense of its own. Tolliver leaned over to get a better look. Maybe that, whatever it was, would pass this way again, and he'd get a better look at it on its next pass. Maybe, in a sudden explosion of spume and cold water, something shot up from the sea. Tolliver reeled back, horrified and screaming, but he was not fast enough to escape this thing. In the last half-second of his life, Tolliver made out sleek skin, the thrashing tail that had propelled this creature out of the black waters, and the huge mouth filled with pointed teeth. And then the thing bit his face entirely off. Sir Edward Fulbright knew precisely what he liked and didn't like. He liked, for example, Fulbright Hall, the ancestral home. Portions of it dated back to the 15th century, when it had been founded by William Fulbright, but the majority of it had been either constructed or restored by his grandfather, Augustus Fulbright, in 1842. There was absolutely no question that the hall was not merely an elegant and spacious domicile, but also the most architecturally interesting home within the boundaries of Devon. He liked even more the Great Hall. This spacious room had been constructed by old William for those grand medieval feasts, with a huge stone fireplace in the centre of one wall, the family crest carved in the stones above the immense mantel. In the old days, whole hogs had been roasted within that fireplace. Nowadays, of course, the cooking was all accomplished in the hall's capacious kitchens. A huge, cheery fire blazed instead in the grate. The wall opposite the fireplace had been one of Grandfather Augustus's main achievements. The old, small windows of the house had been removed, and large glass doors, in the French style but still very attractive, had replaced them. This allowed easier access to the large grounds of the hall and gave a superb view across the moors in all seasons. There was, at the far end of the great hall, a minstrel's gallery that had been carefully rebuilt, and for this occasion held the small orchestra that had been engaged for these festivities. He liked parties, and this was one of the best he had ever hosted. His wife had outdone herself this time, and everyone who was anyone in the region, and quite a few from London, was here. Still, it wasn't every day that one's only daughter announced her engagement. Fulbright watched her whirling one of those new-fashioned dances. He never could recall their silly names, with affection. He liked Alice a great deal. She was a dutiful and beautiful girl of 19 who brought him much pleasure. And he liked her fiancé, young Lieutenant Roger Bridewell. He was a handsome figure of a man, with the prospect of a fine military career. He was smart, well-bred, and quick to understand and follow orders. He was just the kind of son that Fulbright had always wished for. One day, of course, he would inherit Fulbright Hall. Pity that the family name would be gone, but at least Fulbright could rest easy that the hall would be retained by good blood. Bridewell's father had served in the Crimea with Fulbright and had died bravely at Sebastopol, having never seen his newborn son. Fulbright had always felt as if Bridewell's son were a member of the family, and he was most gratified that he was finally to become precisely that. What he didn't like was that friend of Bridewell's. His eyes scanned the room and the many guests dancing, drinking, or chattering. Eventually he saw the man again, and he frowned. The disturbing young man was engaged in conversation with Sir Alexander Cromwell, the local justice of the peace. What the deuce was he up to now? Fulbright had known this Colonel Edmund Ross for barely a week, but he knew that the man had a quiet intensity and some hidden purpose for being here. If he hadn't been Bridewell's guest, Fulbright would have asked the man to leave. There were a number of small matters that disturbed him about Ross. Individually they were almost insignificant, but together they painted a very puzzling portrait of the young man. For example, he wasn't even 30 yet, but had managed to acquire the rank of colonel. He was terribly vague about the regiment he actually served in, and had, in the course of conversations, admitted to serving in 3 different places at the same time. Fulbright would have assumed that the man was a simple blackguard and confidence man, but Bridewell had, rather unusually, gotten rather prickly when Fulbright had raised the possibility. "Sir," Bridewell had replied stiffly, "Colonel Ross has impeccable credentials and is in a position of utmost trust. I would appreciate it if you would not attempt to besmirch his reputation." Fulbright had agreed, but his suspicions still lingered. And just before the commencement of this ball, his butler had mentioned a fresh problem which was still troubling Fulbright. As he watched Ross, he saw Sir Alexander laugh at some witticism and move off. Seizing the opportunity, Fulbright crossed the crowded room to his most troublesome guest. "Sir Edward," Ross said, bowing slightly, "allow me to congratulate you on a most entertaining evening." "Thank you," Fulbright replied gruffly. He stared at the young man. Ross was a handsome scoundrel, no doubt of that. Tall, well-built, with saturnine dark looks and grey eyes that hid his thoughts, but not the intelligence behind them. He dressed impeccably, and had the manners, if not the breeding, of a gentleman. Fulbright again sensed the feeling that there was far more going on with Ross than he ever allowed anyone to know. "I'm sorry that I have to speak to you about that man-servant of yours." "Abercrombie?" Ross barely hid his smile. "And what has the poor fellow done now?" "He's been scaring the serving-maids half out of their wits," Fulbright complained. "Dear me," Ross said. His sympathy seemed quite feigned. "He hasn't been making unwanted advances, I trust?" "Nothing like that," snapped Fulbright. "He's been lurking in the bushes." Ross raised an eyebrow. "Lurking? In the bushes?" He shook his head. "Dear me. Perhaps the maids have simply mistaken his interests in nature for other less polite activities. Abercrombie's quite an avid bird-watcher, you know." Fulbright almost laughed at the thought. He'd seen Ross's man a few times during the past several days. He was a small, shiftless-looking individual with a prominent nose and one of those horrible low-class London accents. If the man looked at the birds, it would be only ones that were on his dinner plate. "At night?" he asked sceptically. Ross shrugged. "I understand that many birds are nocturnal, owls perhaps. But I quite understand your concern, Sir Edward. I shall instruct Abercrombie to confine his avian interests to the daylight hours in future." Fulbright realised that this was probably the most he could expect. "I should appreciate that," he agreed. Bridewell and Alice moved to join them. "Hello, Papa," Alice said, her eyes sparkling with delight. "Isn't this a marvellous affair?" She nodded to Ross. "Edmund, are you enjoying yourself?" Ross bowed to her. "How could I not?" he asked. "Your father is a most gracious host and provides excellent entertainment." He smiled slightly. "Though I fear the activities of my man Abercrombie are somewhat taxing his patience." Bridewell laughed. "What's the old scoundrel been up to now?" "Upsetting the servants, I'm afraid," Ross replied. "Really, Edmund," Alice said, "I don't know why you tolerate the man. I'd have dismissed him long ago. He's positively creepy." Ross didn't seem at all upset by the remark. "He has his uses," he answered. "He's not the best manservant in the world, perhaps, but he's absolutely devoted to me." Ross smiled. "I'm afraid that all the dancing has tired me. I feel the need for a breath of fresh air." "Dancing?" Fulbright snorted. Perhaps Bridewell and even Alice liked this fake, but he didn't. "I haven't seen you dance a step." "I haven't," Ross agreed cheerily, "but watching everyone else has quite exhausted me." "I could do with a little air myself," Bridewell offered. "Alice?" She laughed happily. "I feel as though I'm floating on it." She took her father's arm and smiled at him affectionately. "Why don't we all step outside?" Fulbright didn't really want to socialise further with Ross, but he couldn't deny his daughter's whim. "As you wish," he said. The music was still almost as loud outside, and there were a few knots of other guests out on the terrace. Alice led the three men towards the Italianate fountain that dominated the small walk down toward the formal gardens. From here, in the daytime, was the best view of the moors. Now, of course, it was simply darkness. Clouds hid the moon, and beyond the angelic dispenser of water lay only black night. "Isn't it glorious?" she asked. "If you like it," Bridewell replied, "it must be glorious. You have such exquisite taste." Alice laughed. "Must be why I'm marrying you, then," she said happily. Fulbright was pleased to see his daughter so happy. Marriages weren't necessarily an impediment to love. His own had always made him content, but neither were they exactly conducive to it either. It was good to see that Alice and Bridewell were not merely marrying, but looking forward to the estate. The only dark spot on his pleasure was that damnably secretive Ross. What was he really after? Perhaps he was indeed a friend of Bridewell's, but there was more to it than that. Ross had the air of a man with many secrets, the sort of person who let no one into his thoughts if he could avoid it. So why was he here? Fulbright was not impolite enough to come right out and ask the man directly, but it was a close thing, and he suspected that Ross knew this, and that it amused the younger man for some unfathomable reason. Ross smiled at the couple. "It does the heart good to see a couple so in love," he said. "Then why don't you try it for yourself?" asked Alice, bantering. "Don't think I haven't seen the looks you've been getting from some of my friends." "Most flattered I am too," Ross replied with a laugh. "But I'm not yet prepared to settle down with any woman yet. On the other hand, if Roger hadn't snatched you up at the first opportunity, perhaps you could have persuaded me to change my opinion." Alice laughed, but Fulbright was appalled. It was bad enough having to tolerate this man as a guest. The thought of his courting Alice was too much to bear. "See here, Ross," he began roughly, but he never finished. Despite the strains of music from inside the great hall, there was an unmistakable sound of a howl in the air. The cry rose and fell, the ululation of some weird, wild hunting beast. It struck through to Fulbright's soul, the cry of some terrible creature in pain and anger. "Dear Lord!" gasped Alice. "What in the name of heaven was that?" Bridewell clutched her to his side protectively. "Some creature on the moors," he said, looking almost as pale as the girl. "But I've never heard a sound like that before." "I have," Fulbright snapped, glad to have something other than Ross to vent his anger against. "The day before you arrived, we found one of the ponies ripped to shreds the following day. Some monstrous travesty of nature had torn the poor beast to shreds. The servants tell me that this wasn't the first such slaughter." There was a stir of movement in the darkness beyond the fountain, as the unearthly howl rent the night a second time. The figure that slid out of the shadows was revealed to be none other than Ross's strange manservant. "It's that blinking hound," he announced, ignoring everyone but Ross. 2, perhaps 3 miles out on the moors." "I had gathered as much," Ross said dryly. "It seems to be a fine night for a ride, Sir Edward," he commented, turning to his host. "With your permission, I'll have Abercrombie saddle a couple of horses." Bridewell gasped. "You're not thinking of going out after that creature alone?" "Not alone," agreed Ross. "Abercrombie's coming with me." "What?" Abercrombie shuddered. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I'd rather stay right where I am. I don't like the sound of that thing." "You never liked the sound of anything like work," Ross said without concern. "Sir Edward?" "I'll be damned if I allow you out on the moors at night," Fulbright snapped. "It's dangerous enough out there if you don't know your way, let alone with whatever made that terrible cry out there hunting." "Then perhaps you would be good enough to loan me a guide," Ross asked. "I assure you, this is no frivolous whim." "I'll do better than that," Fulbright growled. "I'll accompany you. Nobody knows the trails better than I do." "Papa!" exclaimed Alice. "I don't think anyone should venture out there tonight. I don't know what that thing was, but it sounded monstrous." By tomorrow it will have vanished, just like last time, Fulbright answered. I want to stop whatever is killing those ponies. Then I'll go with you, Bridewell stated, brooking no argument. The more of us there are, the safer we'll be. Bloomin' Ada, muttered Abercrombie. It'll be a ruddy circus out there. Then, as a thought struck him, Here, with all this help, you won't be needing me, will you? Nice attempt, Ross told him, but you're still coming along. He turned back to Fulbright. I'd be grateful for your help, Sir Edward. But you are coming to catch the beast, not to keep an eye on me, I take it. You almost had to admire the impudence of the man. A little of both, perhaps, Fulbright replied frankly. Ross smiled and nodded. Thank you. It's nice to know where one stands. Well, shall we go? Fulbright turned to Alice. I'm sorry for the interruption, my dear, but we probably shan't be very long. Keep the guests happy, please. Take care, Papa, Alice said. She was obviously very worried. You too, Roger. She turned to Ross. And also you, Colonel. Fulbright led the way, and found to his disgust that Ross's man Abercrombie was walking almost next to him. Didn't the disgusting creature know his place? Ross had fallen back slightly, conversing with Bridewell in low tones. Fulbright glared at the ugly little man beside him. Perhaps you, at least, will have something to show for this night, he said coldly. You could indulge in a spot of ornithology. What? Abercrombie stared at him blankly. Bird-watching man, Fulbright snapped. I understood it was a hobby of yours. Abercrombie guffawed. Watch birds? Me? Stone the crows. Whatever gave you that idea? I don't recall, Fulbright answered icily. So, as he had suspected, Ross had lied about his man's activities. What was Ross's real purpose here, then? And why did he tolerate this obnoxious lowlife? Perhaps it was time that this so-called colonel's secrets were revealed. The TARDIS gave up its secrets rather sparingly. Sarah Jane Smith lay on her back in what the Doctor had dismissingly referred to as the bath, and lazily stirred her hands and feet. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been able to wear a swimsuit, let alone inside the TARDIS. It felt good to be able to simply relax and enjoy herself for once, particularly after the series of harrowing adventures she had experienced. The Doctor had been very moody of late. Well, he was always moody. Sarah imagined it was because of his alien nature and incredibly lengthy lifespan. He claimed at various times to be anything from 400 to a shade over 1,000 years old. For a being who travelled in time as much as the Doctor did, he seemed to be very shoddy about keeping note of his personal time. Either he wasn't certain how to calculate his age due to all the varying times he had stepped into and out from, or, which Sarah personally believed, he had virtually no interest in it. She couldn't blame him, really. Imagine the size of the cake he'd need to fit on several hundred or 1,000 candles. You'd need a flamethrower just to light them, and even the Doctor could never blow them all out with a single breath. Which all meant that the reason the Doctor seemed unsure of his age was because it wasn't simple to work out. But he was showing all the signs of some sort of midlife crisis, if, of course, 400 to 1,000 years old was midlife for a Time Lord. The Doctor was always pretty vague about that, too. He had once claimed to be immortal, give or take a few years, and at another time had said he was as mortal as the next man. Consistency was not a virtue he believed in or practiced. Something was clearly bothering him, and it was a something that their recent encounter with the renegade Time Lord Morbius on that nightmarish world of Khan had exacerbated. The Doctor had been broody enough before that, but now he was positively grim. He had taken to prowling the corridors of the TARDIS, hands rammed firmly into his capacious trouser pockets, his battered felt hat perched precariously atop his mop of thick, dark curls. His sombre face looked more inscrutable than ever, and his tooth-filled grins had virtually vanished. Even his long, multicoloured scarf seemed to have become more subdued to match his mood. Sarah had tried her best to tease him into talking, but that had been no use. When he wanted to, the Doctor could talk the hind legs off a donkey, and probably the front ones too. But when he was in a mood, you couldn't even get the time of day out of him, assuming he either knew or cared what time it was. Sarah had always been rather wary about exploring the TARDIS too far from the main control room. The ship had so many corridors and rooms that it made a labyrinth seem positively simple. You needed either a guide or a long ball of string to find your way around. She had been reading in the room she had taken over for herself when the Doctor had wandered past her open door, lost in his morose thoughts again. Tagging along, she had attempted to cheer him up without any noticeable success. Finally, she'd asked him what some of the rooms they were passing were. "Bathroom," he'd growled, and then ignored her. "Which one?" "All of them." This hadn't made much sense to her until she'd opened the first door. She'd been expecting almost anything from a small closet with a toilet to a whirlpool bath. So she simply stared at amazement at the room within. It was the size of several football fields and held an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Surrounding this were recliners and huge potted ferns and other plants she couldn't even begin to classify. The ceiling was a glowing panel stretching into the distance. "That's a bathroom?" she gasped. "Yes," the Doctor answered, looking at her as if she was some kind of idiot. "Can't you see the rubber duck in the tub?" There was indeed a small yellow plastic duck bobbing up and down in the water. He rolled his eyes and strode on. Since she clearly wasn't going to get any further by talking to him, Sarah had rushed back to her room and into the closet. Like the rest of the TARDIS, her closet seemed to expand to accommodate the clothing she placed in it. The room had clearly belonged to at least 2 other people before her, because she had discovered outfits in 2 distinct styles and sizes already in the closet. One set had been pastel-shaded Victorian outfits. The other had been all silver and leather. Presumably, at least 2 of the Doctor's previous companions had stayed in here. Sarah had simply pushed their stuff to the back and added her own closer to the door. Now she shuffled through the spacey-looking clothes, searching for something she could recall seeing once. Finally she found it. A one-piece bathing suit of some kind of opalescent material. It shimmered with pinks and silvers as she held it up to see if it might fit her. She'd never thought to bring along a swimsuit of her own. Most of the seas they had landed, besides, turned out to be filled with acid, or monsters, or both. The suit had moulded itself to her body when she'd tried it on. It was perhaps a trifle daring, being very low-cut in several places, but for the TARDIS's bathroom it was fine. And here she was, lazing in a huge pool, inside a time and space machine taking her who knew where in the cosmos. It was something that anyone else might have found utterly bizarre, but which Sarah simply accepted. One thing you had to take into your stride with the Doctor was the unexpected. And at least this was pleasantly unexpected, unlike the usual turn of events. Eventually, though, she tired of lazily swimming around and returned to her room to dry off and dress. She considered returning to her book again, but she was getting a trifle hungry. That meant a trip to the food machine. Since that was in the room next to the control room, she supposed she ought to take a look in there as well, in case the TARDIS had landed, or the doctor had decided to do more of his running repairs. Munching on a Mars bar-like meal of calamari and clam sauce, she wandered into the control room. She wasn't too surprised to discover the doctor already there, brooding over the time rotor. The lights from the spinning vanes within the rotor cast weird shadows across his gloomy face. "Is it Halloween already?" she asked lightly. Sometimes that helped drag the doctor from his introspections. The Time Lord gave a sudden jerk, as though he hadn't noticed her arrival. It was quite possible that he hadn't. As he straightened up, a dismal cloud seemed to lift from within his eyes. There was a sudden flash of teeth, and he brushed back his tangled hair. "Oh, Sarah Jane," he said brightly. "I'm afraid I've been neglecting you, haven't I?" "Uh-huh," she agreed, crossing the large room to join him at the central console. She was relieved that he seemed to have cast off his depressing introspection. "I'm sorry." His eyes sparkled with the old humour once again. "I was lost in my thoughts. I have so many. It's easy to get lost." Sarah grinned and wolfed down the last of her meal. "Do you have 2 brains as well as 2 hearts?" she asked. "No. Perhaps I should, though. I'll have to put in a request. Or would that make me a dinosaur?" He started to study the instrument panel. "Ah, we're still in flight." "Where are we going?" asked Sarah. Most of the instruments on the panels weren't labelled, and they didn't seem to be measuring anything that was at all familiar. The few dials and meters that did have labels were generally named in the kind of scrawl that a drunken chicken with its head chopped off might have made. "Nowhere, anywhere." An idea seemed to strike him. "I'll tell you what. Why don't you pick our destination?" "Are you joking?" Sarah gave a snort. "You know that the TARDIS never gets us where you aim for." "That's not true," the doctor exclaimed. His innate honesty compelled him to add, "Well, not always true." "And the old girl is in a good mood right now, aren't you?" he asked the mushroom-shaped control console, patting it fondly. He often spoke as if the TARDIS were alive and understood every word they said. For all Sarah knew, that might well be true. The TARDIS was, at the very least, an incredibly sophisticated machine. That it might be aware and intelligent wouldn't surprise her too much. "Do you really think you might be able to get where you're aiming?" asked Sarah. "Probably. Let's try, shall we?" He gave another of his grins. "So, where in all of time and space would you like to go?" "Metabilis. Tarbethon Beta. Argos." Sarah shrugged. "I don't know," she confessed. "I've never really thought about aiming to go anywhere. I've got rather used to simply wandering." "My moods must be infectious," he replied. "Well, is there anybody you've always wanted to meet? Anyone at all? Plato, Genghis Khan, Flandro Cabo, Charlie Chaplin?" Laughing, Sarah considered the idea. To be able to meet anyone at all, from any world or time. "Are you really serious?" "Cross my hearts." Sarah shook her head in wonder. "You mean you could really control the TARDIS if you want to?" He shrugged. "Only when it's very important." He gave her another of his engaging smiles. "To be honest, Sarah Jane, I usually don't bother. It's much more fun to let the old girl take me where she wills. After all, I've got nothing but time, and my appointment book is almost empty this millennium. So, who will it be?" "Well," Sarah began, her mind having finally focused, "you'll probably think this is silly." "Oh, I doubt it," he replied airily. "After all, once you've met Marie Antoinette, almost anyone after that seems to be very serious." "I'd like to meet Rudyard Kipling." "Kipling?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's very unusual." "It's just that he was a journalist who became an absolutely marvellous writer," Sarah explained quickly, afraid he did think her choice was rather frivolous. "And I grew up on his stuff." "Oh, I'm not complaining," the doctor assured her. "Quite to the contrary. I'm rather fond of Kipling myself. Far cold our navies melt away, on dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. Stirring, eh? The doctor grinned again. It's just that he's one of the people I've never met and always wanted to. That means that this will be a doubly interesting trip. He stared at the panels and began resetting the controls. Hang on to your hat, Sarah Jane. Are you sure you can get us to meet Kipling? She asked. Trust me, he replied. When have I ever let you down? Too many times. That was in the past. And we've already passed through those times. This time we'll definitely get there. Now, where and when exactly? Sarah wasn't sure she could really believe him. Still, maybe it was worth the risk. If he messed up as usual, at least she wouldn't be too disappointed. Lahore, India, February 1889, when he was just getting established as a writer. She watched him enter figures into the TARDIS's controls. I'd feel a lot happier if this thing came with an owner's manual. It does, he said, dancing around the console to another panel. I think I still have it somewhere. He frowned. You know, I think I may be a trifle overdue for her 3,000-year checkup. There is a handbook for this thing. Sarah could hardly believe her ears. Why don't you use it? She didn't mean to be rude, the doctor whispered to the panel, and patted it consolingly. To Sarah, he said, that would be so boring. It's much more fun to experiment, don't you think? Besides, I can't remember where I put it, or who I was when I put it there. He shrugged. If it's needed, it'll turn up. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she settled for an exasperated sigh. It was extremely difficult to believe that the doctor would actually manage to get them where and when he had promised. He looked up at her. Better get changed, he advised her. It's very hot in India. Something white would be best. If we get to India, she retorted. She remembered one of those Victorian dresses in her closet that she'd worn before. It had been that time they'd had the run-in with Sutek. The doctor had mentioned that it had belonged to a former companion of his called Victoria. Leaving the doctor to fiddle with the controls, she went to put it on. The night was cold, chilling the marrow in Fulbright's bones. The wind howled mournfully around the bare rocks and craggy outcroppings which rose like grey ghosts from the blackness of the moor. The moon was gone, and clouds scurried like rats across the sky. It was a night, the locals would say, when Satan himself was known to walk upon the moor. Fulbright remembered with a shudder some of the tales he had been told as a child growing up out here in the bleak wilds before being sent to the boarding school that had beaten the child out of him to make him the man he was today. Tales of the devil striding across the snow-strewn hills, or of giant, fiery hounds from hell running down their terrified human prey. Tales of monsters that lived within the bogs, reaching out with twiggy fingers to grip the ankles of unwary travellers and drag them down to the murky depths where they would be devoured. On nights like these, it was hard to completely dismiss such tales as a rank superstition. He knew, with the intellectual part of his mind, that such legends were fancies born in drinks and fears, but in the darker, deeper, colder portions of his mind, the fears were still there, and still as potent as they had been when they had induced nightmares and bedwetting in a 4-year-old boy. But he was no longer that boy, he was a man, and this was a task for a man. Burying the terrors that wanted to seize and shake him, he hunkered down in the saddle and pressed his nervous steed onward into the jumble of rocks. Behind him, he could hear the other horses nervously picking their own paths. Both Bridewell and Ross were superb horsemen, having no trouble keeping up the pace. Abercrombie, on the other hand, was merely adequate, and Fulbright suspected that the reason he seemed to lag behind had more to do with fear than lack of riding ability. Since the initial sounds that had drawn them out onto the moor this dismal night, there had been no further indication that their quarry was still around. Then again, if it were hunting, it was hardly likely to advertise its presence, was it? And what were they hunting? Some wild beast escaped from the menagerie of a collector, perhaps? During his days in India, Fulbright had seen both cheetahs and tigers make their kills. Both were powerful, silent hunters and quite capable of disemboweling the ponies that roamed the hills here. But neither was capable of producing the terrible sounds that they had heard earlier. The beast had sounded more like a hound of some kind. But what kind of dog ever known to man could have produced a howl such as they had heard? None that Fulbright knew, and anyone in the country would have admitted that if ever a man knew his hounds, that man was Edward Fulbright. The memories of the local boys telling tales of a spectral hound that haunted the moors flooded back to him. The beast was supposed to possess eyes of fire, teeth of pure flame, and an insatiable appetite for wicked children. Nothing more than a horror tale told to terrify the young. And yet there were children missing. Cromwell had mentioned it earlier in the day. As a justice of the peace, Cromwell was perforce privy to police reports. Several local children seem to have vanished without trace recently, including one from a boarding school in the area. Most disappearances could be laid easily to any number of factors, but the school child had been the son of a minor Indian official, and there had been an investigation. It had turned up nothing, but there were many questions unanswered. Was it even barely possible that there was something out here that stalked the night and was preying on human beings? Even as the thought fastened hold on his imagination, Fulbright gave a start of shock. Out of the blackness ahead came a scream such as he had never heard in all his days. He had seen action on 3 continents and seen and heard men die in terrible pain. Never, outside the pits of hell, would he expect to hear such a scream. It was a high-pitched howl, throaty and filled with horror. It didn't sound even remotely human, and it set fire to every nerve in his body. And not his alone. As his mount shied in terror, he fought to control the horrified steed. His companions faced similar struggles, as the other horses were equally unnerved. "Bloody Nora!" exclaimed Abercrombie, his voice trembling. "What the bleeding hell was that?" "Whatever it was," Bridewell exclaimed, his own voice shaking, "it can't have been human." "It wasn't," Ross announced with certainty. He alone didn't sound on the verge of panic. Was it because he knew something that the rest of them didn't? "It was one of the local ponies. Our target must have just slaughtered it. Come along!" Ross kneed his steed hard, urging it forward. The beast, perhaps wiser than its rider, fought and bucked to retreat instead. Ross wore it down, however, and pressed ahead. Fulbright would just as soon have returned home, but he couldn't back down now. Instead, he managed to control his own rebellious, terrified mount and forced it after Ross. Bridewell fell in behind him. "Lummy," Abercrombie announced. "I ain't staying around here alone." He brought up the rear as they moved through the rocks. The cry had certainly been close. As they threaded the minimal pathways, Fulbright hit what was almost a wall of such an overpowering stench that he almost vomited on the spot. Blood, bile, and other noisome odours gripped his throat and lungs. Then, as they rounded a rocky pinnacle, they saw the unfortunate prey. It probably had been one of the local ponies, as Ross had claimed. It was almost impossible to be certain, so little of it remained intact. The stocky little body had been ripped apart by a creature of massive power. What remained of the poor beast's hide was torn by the tracks of savage claws. The pony had not merely been disemboweled, but shredded. Globs of flesh, dripping and steaming, were scattered across some 20 feet of the pathway. Even in the poor light, Fulbright could make out far too many details. Even if he could have seen nothing, the stench alone would have told him more than enough. "Dear God," he muttered, fighting back the urge to be sick. "What monster could have done such a thing?" "Whatever it is," Ross told him, his face strained and grim, "it is only a short distance ahead of us. It must be carrying the missing portions of this unfortunate creature to devour at its leisure. Perhaps it'll be unable to outrun us." "Do you want us to chase a creature capable of doing this?" Bridewell waved his arm at the grisly remains. "You and Sir Edward have done more than enough, Roger," Ross replied. "No one could fault you for returning home." "I could," Fulbright snapped. "This monster roams where I make my home. I'll be damned if I allow it to escape me." Ross gave him an appraising glance. "Good for you, Sir Edward," he replied. "Then stay close to me. We may need one another's aid before this hunt is over." With a sly smile, he pressed his horse onward again. Fulbright fell in slightly behind Ross. This man might be an enigma, but he seemed to be brave enough. Or was the situation something he knew more about than he was letting on? It was impossible to dismiss the feeling he had that Ross was more than he claimed. The night was broken once again by another unearthly noise. This one didn't sound like any they had heard yet, nor did it sound entirely natural. It was a booming noise about a mile or so ahead of them, rising and falling like the pounding of some immense steam hammer or an off-key hurdy-gurdy of immense size and power. Before Fulbright could make out more, the noise had ceased. All he knew for certain was that it was ahead of them and that the quarry they were hunting must have been heading in its direction. "India," Sarah Jane shivered with cold as she stepped out of the TARDIS's doors and into the bleak night. "This doesn't feel like a tropical country to me." The doctor shrugged. "It gets very cold at night in the Indian foothills," he told her. "These aren't foothills," she answered, as something squelched under her feet. "It feels more like a swamp. Are you absolutely certain this is India?" "Absolutely." "Then it's probably the Isle of Ely, or another weird alien planet." The doctor half turned. He was hardly more than a shape in the gloom. "Do I detect a note of cynicism?" "A note?" Sarah laughed bitterly. How could she even have fantasized that he would get this right? More like a whole ruddy symphony. "Well," he said, sounding hurt, "I may be out by a little." "A little?" she cried. "If this is anywhere near Lahore, I'm a Dutchman. I'd be very surprised if we're even on the same planet." "This is definitely Earth," he said, sounding miffed. "Its smell is unmistakable. I'll agree I may have strayed a few miles. That's all." His foot squelched down in something. "We're most likely in the vicinity of some river. Probably the monsoon season." "Then you've missed the right time too," Sarah snapped. "Honestly, I don't know why I ever listen to you." "Because I'm such a wonderful conversationalist," he answered. "Well, let's just find a native and then we can—" Before he could finish his thought, there was a noise ahead in the darkness. Sarah tried to make out what was making it, but saw nothing. It sounded like some animal running hard, something large, and it sprang out of the blackness and seemed to be almost as startled to see her as Sarah was to see it. The beast paused in mid-stride, then opened its mouth. Something it had been carrying in its huge jaws fell to the ground, spraying fresh blood as it bounced. The monster bared massive fangs and growled deep within its immense throat. Sarah staggered back, terrified. The beast was a dog of some kind, in the same way that a great white shark was a fish of some kind. This apparition was immense, over 5 feet at the shoulder, the size of a horse. Its body was powerfully muscled, its jaw overcrowded with 4-inch fangs that dripped saliva and blood as it growled at her. Great eyes glared at her in shock and hatred, and 4 massive paws clawed at the ground. Sarah felt her strength and sanity giving out. Her heart seemed to be trying to hammer itself free from her ribs, and she was in danger of fainting. As she stared at the monster, it gave a challenging roar and leapt straight toward her.